We're going to explain the index error too many indices for tensor in PyTorch. This error pops up when you try to access a tensor's elements using more indices than its dimensions allow. PyTorch tensors are multi-dimensional arrays, and the number of indices you use must match the number of dimensions. Let's break down how this happens and how to fix it. 1. Understanding tensor dimensions. A tensor's dimensionality is determined by its shape. A tensor with a shape of 3, 4 is a two-dimensional tensor, a matrix, with 3 rows and 4 columns. A tensor with a shape of 2, 3, 5 is a three-dimensional tensor. Each number in the shape tuple represents the size of that dimension. 2. Indexing tensors. To access an element, you provide an index for each dimension. For a 3, 4 tensor, you'd use 2 indices. The first selects the row, and the second selects the column. For example, tensor 2 would access the element in the second row, index 1, and third column, index 2. If you try tensor 2, 3, you'll get the index error too many indices for tensor because you're providing 3 indices for a two-dimensional tensor. 3. Common causes of the error. The most frequent cause is a mismatch between the number of indices used and the tensor's dimensions. This often arises from A. Incorrect assumptions about tensor shape. You might be assuming a tensor has a certain shape, but it actually has a different one. Always double-check the shape using shape attribute. For example, print myTensor.shape will display the shape of myTensor. B. Off by 1 errors. A simple mistake in indexing, such as forgetting that indexing starts at 0, can lead to this error. For example, if you have a tensor with 5 elements, shape 5, trying to access tensor will result in an error because the valid indices are 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. C. Incorrectly reshaping or squeezing. Operations like PyTorch reshape and dot squeeze alter the tensor's shape. If you don't account for this change in shape, subsequent indexing operations might fail. D. Iterating through tensors with incorrect dimensions. When looping through a tensor, make sure your loop counter aligns with the tensor's dimensions. If you're iterating through a 2D tensor using only one loop, you'll likely run into this error. 4. Debugging strategies. To debug, first verify the tensor's shape using shape. Then, carefully review your indexing to ensure that you're using the correct number of indices and that those indices are within the bounds of each dimension. Use print statements to check intermediate tensor shapes and values to pinpoint the exact location of the error. Using a debugger can help step through the code to see the exact state of variables and tensors at each step. 5. Example. Let's say you have a tensor IndexError random 32 x10 is valid. However, x10 is invalid and will give you the index error, too many indices for tensor, because you're providing 3 indices for a 2D tensor. By understanding tensor dimensions, practicing careful indexing, and using debugging techniques, you can effectively avoid and solve the index error, too many indices for tensor in your PyTorch code. Remember to always double-check your tensor's shape and the number of indices you are using.